The Doors lead singer Jim Morrison died in Paris, France, nearly 54 years ago at the age of 27. But one fan thinks the counterculture icon is alive and well.
Jim Morrison, the enigmatic frontman of The Doors, was a rock star whose larger-than-life persona captivated millions. But his unconventional behavior offstage left a trail of fractured relationships. While his wild stage presence, poetic lyrics, and raw charisma made him a cultural icon, many of his fellow musicians couldn't stand his reckless antics and self-destructive tendencies. From his controversial stage performances to his disregard for professional boundaries, Morrison's actions alienated even the most revered figures in rock history. Today, we're looking at 10 rock stars who hated Jim Morrison. Let's get started. Number 10. Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin and Jim Morrison sealed their mutual disapproval during the Seattle Pop Festival in July 1969, a three-day rock event held from July 25th to July 27th in Woodinville, Washington. Both The Doors and Led Zeppelin were on the lineup, though at drastically different points in their trajectories. At the time, Led Zeppelin was a relatively fresh force in the music world, having released their self-titled debut album just 6 months earlier in January 1969. Despite being new, they were rapidly gaining a reputation for electrifying performances, musical precision, and a kind of raw but tightly controlled energy. The Doors, by contrast, were already rock icons, known for their controversial frontman Jim Morrison and their dark, psychedelic blues rock sound. But Morrison himself was becoming increasingly erratic. During their Seattle Pop Festival appearance, The Doors performed a headlining set, but it quickly turned into a chaotic and disturbing display. Jim Morrison appeared heavily intoxicated. His behavior on stage was far from coherent. Instead of focusing on the music, he spent much of the time yelling at the crowd, making obscene gestures, and engaging in taunting monologues that alienated rather than energized the audience. This wasn't unusual for Morrison in this period, as his live performances had become increasingly unpredictable. What made it particularly notable here was the presence of Led Zeppelin, who were watching and evaluating a band they once might have looked up to. Jimmy Page, the virtuoso guitarist of Led Zeppelin, acknowledged Jim Morrison's skill as a lyricist, but when it came to Morrison's on-stage behavior, Page was deeply unimpressed. Page felt that Morrison had squandered his gifts by allowing his performances to spiral into a display of ego. Robert Plant, the charismatic vocalist of Led Zeppelin, was even less forgiving. Plant, who was known for his commanding stage presence and discipline, found Morrison's behavior not just unprofessional, but downright sickening to watch. This wasn't just about clashing styles or musical philosophies, it was also a reflection of broader shifts happening in rock music in 1969. The psychedelic revolution of the mid-60s, of which Morrison was a poster child, was starting to fade, and the era of arena rock and technical mastery, exemplified by Led Zeppelin, was rising. Morrison's on-stage breakdowns, drunken rants, and refusal to conform to any expectations of consistency or professionalism were becoming symbols of a dying ethos. His performance at Seattle was a tipping point that showed how alienating his persona had become, even to his peers. This incident was not isolated. Just months earlier, in March 1969, Morrison had been arrested in Miami for allegedly exposing himself during a show. So one can see how Morrison's behavior was unsettling even to his peers. But the list does not end here. In fact, we're just getting started. Number 9. Jimmyi Hendris. While both Jimmyi Hendris and Jim Morrison were towering figures of the 1960s counterculture and frequently performed in the same circles, their personalities and professional standards often clashed. In March 1968, at the Scene Club in New York City, Morrison drunkenly joined Hendris on stage during an impromptu jam session, grabbing the mic and launching into an incoherent, often obscene tirade, while Hendris and other musicians tried to hold the performance together. The recording that emerged from that night, later bootlegged under various titles like Woke Up This Morning and Found Myself Dead, is a surreal and jarring piece of audio history. Hendrix plays with intensity and discipline, while Morrison slurs, screams, and groans over the music in a display that many later called embarrassing. For Hendrix, who was already struggling to be taken seriously in a white-dominated industry despite his unparalleled talent, such chaos was a liability. He had fought hard to transcend the image of a wild, drug-fueled guitar slinger and instead be seen as a visionary, experimental musician. Morrison's reckless antics on stage and the attention they drew ran counter to everything Hendrix valued in performance. Though Hendrix was no stranger to the use of psychedelics or the excesses of the era, he tended to remain focused when performing. His drug use was often ritualized, tied to creativity and experimentation, rather than chaos and spectacle. Morrison, by contrast, leaned heavily into the myth of the doomed artist, letting his demons bleed into his performances in a way that frequently derailed concerts. Hendrix found this unsettling, especially as Morrison's behavior became increasingly erratic toward the end of the 1960s. Friends of Hendrix later said he referred to Morrison as a mess, and his avoidance of Morrison after the Scene Club incident spoke volumes. Number 8. Dennis Wilson. In early 1968, Dennis Wilson made the catastrophic mistake of inviting Manson and his female followers into his home, a lavish Sunset Boulevard mansion that quickly became the Manson family's unofficial headquarters. Wilson was fascinated by Manson's charisma and apparent songwriting ability. For a while, he even tried to help Manson get a record deal. But as time passed, Manson's volatility became too much to ignore. Wilson eventually fled his own home to escape the growing threat, leaving the Manson family behind and cutting ties completely by the end of 1968. Jim Morrison, meanwhile, never had a formal relationship with Manson, but his own descent into alcohol, psychedelics, and philosophical obsession with chaos and destruction blurred boundaries that made others, like Dennis Wilson, wary. Rumors began circulating in late 1968 and into 1969 that Morrison had spent time socializing with people in Manson's orbit. Not Manson directly, but enough to worry those who already viewed Morrison's behavior as erratic. Whether these rumors were exaggerated or not, they had an effect. Morrison had always flirted with imagery and themes of death, rebellion, and the end of civilization, especially in poems and interviews. But post-1968, after the Manson family tragedy, which took place in August 1969, such themes stopped being artistic provocations and began to feel threatening and real. Morrison's offhanded references to apocalypse, violence, and ego death suddenly took on a disturbing new dimension when juxtaposed with the real-life carnage caused by someone who had briefly circulated among the same social scene. Dennis Wilson, reeling from his own close brush with Manson, grew deeply uncomfortable with Morrison's public and private comments that seemed to trivialize, romanticize, or at least echo the chaos Manson embodied. Accounts from those close to Wilson at the time suggest that he began distancing himself from Morrison in mid to late 1969, particularly after the Tate LaBianca tragedy and the media frenzy surrounding Manson's connection to Hollywood figures. Wilson felt exposed, ashamed of his former hospitality to Manson, and worried that lingering associations could damage what remained of his credibility. Morrison, who had never been known for tact, didn't do much to assuage those fears. The final break came not just through whispered connections and bad vibes, but in the form of a physical confrontation. This altercation took place sometime in early 1970. Morrison made a flippant remark, possibly referencing Manson or mocking Wilson's involvement, and Dennis, already on edge and struggling with his own substance abuse and mental health issues, lashed out. The argument escalated into a brief but intense scuffle, with onlookers pulling the two apart before it turned into a full-blown brawl. After that, any lingering friendship or tolerance between them ended completely. Number 7. John Densmore. John Densmore, the drummer of The Doors, was one of the few people in Jim Morrison's immediate orbit who both revered his poetic genius and resented his erratic, often destructive behavior. Unlike the more indulgent or passive members of the band, Densmore had a strong moral and artistic compass and wasn't afraid to challenge Morrison, even when it meant risking friction within the group. As early as 1967, tensions had already started to brew. During performances, Morrison increasingly abandoned structure, turning what should have been rehearsed sets into unpredictable, chaotic affairs. On stage, he would forget lyrics, scream spontaneously into the microphone, incite the crowd, or drop to the floor and refuse to sing at all. For Densmore, who had studied jazz and took performance seriously, this was embarrassing. Yet in the beginning, there was still a degree of admiration. Morrison's wild energy was, after all, part of what gave the Doors their edge. The real turning point came in 1969, the year of the infamous Miami concert, on March 1st at the Dinner Key Auditorium. Morrison showed up drunk, incoherent, and seemed to be intentionally provoking the audience. While rumors of indecent exposure were later proven unsubstantiated, the damage was done. Multiple band members, especially Densmore, were mortified by Morrison's behavior. The aftermath of that night triggered a wave of canceled shows, public backlash, and a court case that haunted Morrison for the rest of his life. Densmore later said that Morrison had crossed a line. Even in the studio, Morrison's substance abuse became an increasing problem. Sessions that should have taken hours stretched into days because Jim would be too intoxicated to perform, or he would get into arguments and storm out. During the recording of the album Morrison Hotel in late 1969 and later L.A. Woman in 1970 to 71, Densmore often clashed with Morrison. Their personal disagreements became more pronounced as Morrison spiraled further into self-destruction. In one striking instance, Morrison arrived drunk at a recording session and began verbally abusing everyone present. Densmore told him, "I can't do this anymore," and even considered quitting the band. What kept him from walking away entirely was a deep love for the music and a hope, fading by the day, that Morrison would eventually stabilize. But that hope died slowly. Morrison's health visibly declined in 1971, and though the band managed to complete L.A. Woman, which would go on to become one of their most celebrated records, Densmore viewed the sessions with mixed feelings. The songs were strong, yes, but they were also drenched in the shadow of Jim's looming collapse. When Morrison left for Paris in the spring of 1971, Densmore privately suspected it might be the end. When news broke of Morrison's death in July 1971, Densmore's reaction was a complex mix of grief, anger, and grim relief. He had tried, more than once, to warn Morrison and urge him to pull back, but Jim had pushed everyone away, choosing the myth over the man. Number 6. Ray Manzaric. The bond between Ray Manzaric and Jim Morrison began well before the band took shape, back when they were both film students at UCLA in the early 1960s. In that sun-soaked, experimental atmosphere, Manzaric was instantly captivated by Morrison's poetic mind and enigmatic charisma. He famously encouraged Morrison to turn his stream-of-consciousness lyrics into a rock band, planting the seed that would eventually become the Doors. Yet, while Manzaric deeply admired Morrison's artistry, over time, that admiration was repeatedly tested by Morrison's increasingly volatile behavior, on and off the stage. By the time the Doors released their debut album in January 1967, Manzaric had already begun to see both sides of Morrison. On one hand, Jim was capable of transforming even the most obscure lyrics into hypnotic incantations. Songs like The End and When the Music's Over came alive under Morrison's magnetic delivery, and Manzaric's swirling organ work became the perfect complement. But on the other hand, Morrison's substance abuse was rapidly accelerating. He often arrived late to rehearsals, if at all, and his performances teetered between transcendence and train wreck. Manzaric tried to defend Morrison to the rest of the band and the press, but that defense had its limits. The infamous March 1st, 1969 concert in Miami, where Morrison's drunken behavior led to allegations of indecent exposure, was a watershed moment. Though Morrison was never conclusively proven to have exposed himself, the controversy led to cancelled shows and legal battles that dragged on for years. In public, Manzaric attempted to downplay the incident. Privately, however, he was frustrated and overwhelmed. He knew they were losing momentum, not because of the music, but because Morrison was becoming impossible to manage. During this time, Manzaric often tried to convince Jim to clean up, to take his role seriously, and to understand the responsibility that came with his influence. But Morrison was notoriously resistant to advice, especially when it came from those closest to him. Despite his frustration, Manzaric never stopped believing in Morrison's genius. During the recording of Morrison Hotel in late 1969 and later L.A. Woman in 1970, he pushed to keep Morrison engaged, sometimes playing peacekeeper between Jim and drummer John Densmore. But even as they produced some of their most mature and introspective work, the internal strain was undeniable. Morrison was bloated from alcohol, emotionally distant, and often disappeared for days at a time. Manzaric, ever the optimist of the group, kept holding on to the hope that Paris would be a reset button for Morrison, a chance to rest, write, and recover. This, of course, never happened. Morrison died on July 3, 1971, in a Paris bathtub at the age of 27. Shocking, right? Well, the list is still pretty long. Number 5. David Crosby. David Crosby, a founding member of the influential bands Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and later Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, had a complicated relationship with Jim Morrison. Crosby's view of Morrison's behavior became increasingly negative in 1968 when Morrison's stage antics, his drinking, erratic movements, and overall reckless behavior became the subject of much public attention. Jim Morrison, a true embodiment of the counterculture's wild side, often gave performances that were more about his persona than about the music itself. Crosby, who had a deep respect for music and its role in elevating society, found this behavior unprofessional and troubling. The fact that Morrison's wild antics overshadowed his music on occasion, particularly during live performances, further alienated Crosby. During a live performance in 1969 at the Fillmore East, when Crosby, along with his bandmates, was in attendance, an intoxicated Morrison grabbed the microphone during a jam session. Crosby found Morrison's stage behavior not only disruptive, but also embarrassing to watch. In interviews after the incident, Crosby didn't shy away from expressing his disdain for Morrison's approach to life and art. He criticized Morrison for being too self-indulgent and noted that the Doors frontman had a tendency to let his persona overtake his work. The friction intensified as the 1970s approached, with the rock and roll scene becoming more divided between those who embraced the excesses of fame and those who sought to use music as a vehicle for social and political change. Crosby, who had been politically active in the anti-war and civil rights movements, viewed Morrison's focus on self-destruction as an irresponsible abandonment of the power that music could have in shaping the world. Morrison's famous connection to the Lizard King persona, with its overtones of existential despair and hedonistic indulgence, was a direct contrast to Crosby's philosophy that music should serve something greater than personal gratification. Tragically, both men would meet untimely deaths, with Morrison passing away in 1971 at the age of 27, and Crosby surviving a tumultuous career that included personal and professional struggles. Crosby would later express his sorrow over Morrison's passing, acknowledging that despite their differences, Morrison was an undeniably talented musician. Yet, the strained relationship between the two never fully healed. Number 4. Janis Joplin. During a party in 1968, hosted by producer Paul Rothchild, Joplin and Morrison, who were nearing the peak of their fame, interfaced in the worst possible way. Morrison had recently stirred controversy with his provocative stage antics, while Joplin, who had already made a massive impact with Big Brother and the holding company, was asserting herself as a formidable solo performer. Morrison arrived at the gathering already several drinks in and clearly looking to cause a scene. He began relentlessly misbehaving with Joplin almost from the moment he saw her. Joplin rebuffed his advances bluntly, but Morrison kept pushing. He followed her around the party, made crass remarks, and mocked her in front of others. At one point, he even grabbed her or pulled on her hair. Joplin had enough of this and finally retaliated. She smashed a bottle of Southern Comfort over his head. The fallout from that night was immediate. Joplin was furious. Unlike others who tried to rationalize Morrison's behavior as part of his artistic mystique, Joplin had no patience for that sort of mythology. She left the party in disgust and never forgave him. When asked later about Morrison, she would make no attempt to hide her disdain. She referred to him in poor words and dismissed the idea that there was anything deep behind his provocations. To her, he was just another entitled man who thought his genius gave him the right to treat people like playthings. Tragically, neither would live to see the 1970s unfold. Joplin died of an overdose on October 4, 1970, at the age of 27, just 9 months before Morrison was found dead in a bathtub in Paris. Number 3. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa's disdain for Jim Morrison was neither vague nor subtle. Though they orbited similar scenes in Los Angeles, Zappa with the Mothers of Invention and Morrison with the Doors, their paths didn't cross often in a friendly way. Zappa had long been vocal about his skepticism toward drug use in music, despite being lumped in with the psychedelic movement. He neither smoked nor drank to excess, and frequently used his art to mock the clichés of hippie culture. In that light, Morrison's drug-fueled escapades, his on-stage meltdowns, and his tendency to romanticize chaos were more than just distasteful. They were dangerous. Zappa considered them not only irresponsible, but emblematic of the worst excesses of a generation that often confused liberation with destruction. The stark contrast between the two was perhaps most evident in their approach to performance. Morrison's stage presence was an unpredictable spectacle. For many, it was electrifying, primal, and poetic. But for Zappa, it was juvenile and indulgent. He viewed Morrison not as a misunderstood artist, but as someone who had mistaken reckless behavior for authenticity. The infamous Miami concert on March 1, 1969, where Morrison was arrested, only confirmed Zappa's suspicions. Zappa's concern wasn't limited to Morrison alone, it extended to the culture that enabled him. He was sharply critical of the idea that audiences would idolize a figure whose behavior, in his view, contributed to the normalization of drug abuse and nihilism. Morrison's increasing reliance on intoxicants was well known, and his lyrics, while often praised for their surreal and mythic overtones, also hinted at his own disintegration. In interviews, Zappa never directly attacked Morrison by name very often, but he did issue broad statements that left little doubt about who he meant. In one instance, when criticizing the drug-addled frontmen of popular bands, he described them as idiots high on their own hype, whose stage presence was more about flailing around than playing music. When pressed on the Doors specifically, Zappa remarked that they were not very interesting musically, and referred to their theatricality as amateur drama. Zappa also worried about the influence Morrison might have on impressionable audiences, how his behavior could be romanticized, and how the myth of the doomed poet could encourage people to follow his path. In that sense, Zappa wasn't just critiquing Morrison's choices, but trying to protect the integrity of a scene he believed was already spiraling into caricature. Number 2. Lou Reed. Lou Reed's mockery of Morrison often came in the form of scathing commentary during interviews. In the early 1970s, when asked about the Doors, Reed quipped that Morrison was a buffoon in leather pants who thought he was Rimbaud. That dig wasn't just about style, it was an indictment of Morrison's tendency to drape his lyrics in lofty references to mythology philosophy, and symbolism, which Reed saw as performative rather than profound. Reed, who came out of the gritty avant-garde art rock scene in New York, leaned toward raw, unfiltered storytelling about real life, addiction, love, pain, and sexuality, with none of the florid mysticism that Morrison indulged in. To Reed, Morrison's self-styled image as a shaman poet was little more than self-indulgence dressed up as profundity. The Velvet Underground, the band Reed fronted, was known for stripping rock down to its bleakest and most honest core. With songs about heroin, urban decay, and marginalized people, Reed built a career on challenging the listener to confront the uncomfortable. Morrison, by contrast, often veiled his songs in a dreamlike abstraction that Reed found insincere. Songs like The End or When the Music's Over, while considered anthems of 1960s psychedelia, were to Reed more like empty theater, too concerned with grandiosity to be truly meaningful. He resented what he saw as Morrison's ability to coast on charisma and spectacle rather than content. Their mutual circles overlapped only slightly, and when they did, the encounters were reportedly frosty. Morrison was more at home in Los Angeles, surrounded by film students, counterculture intellectuals, and the desert's spiritual emptiness. Reed, hardened by the streets of New York and deeply embedded in Andy Warhol's factory scene, didn't have time for what he considered faux philosophical posturing. He saw Morrison as someone who confused being intoxicated with being enlightened, a trope Reed despised. During a private conversation relayed secondhand by producer Paul A. Rothschild, who worked with both artists at different points, Reed remarked that Morrison was too into himself to say anything useful. Morrison's behavior also didn't help his case. His infamous Miami concert in March 1969, which led to his arrest for lewd behavior, only reinforced Reed's image of him as a self-obsessed provocateur rather than a true innovator. Reed, who had a complicated but often deeply self-aware relationship with his own vices, bristled at what he perceived as Morrison's glorification of chaos. In Morrison's spiraling descent into alcoholism and erratic performances, Reed saw not the tortured artist, but a man performing a parody of one. Even the Doors' musical style didn't escape Reed's criticism. He found their blues rock foundation predictable and their extended jams indulgent. Unlike the jagged minimalism of the Velvet Underground's sound, which often used silence and dissonance for effect, the Doors' lengthy keyboard solos and dramatic shifts in tempo struck Reed as overwrought. In one particular interview, Reed said Morrison sounded like he was always auditioning for a part in a bad Greek tragedy. Perhaps most telling was Reed's refusal to buy into the mythos that sprang up around Morrison after his death in July 1971. While many mourned the singer as a generational voice silenced too soon, Reed stayed consistent in his criticism. Brutal, right? Well, we're not done just yet. Number 1. Jerry Garcia. Jerry Garcia, the legendary frontman of the Grateful Dead, was never one to mince words when it came to his impressions of other musicians, particularly those whose artistic philosophy clashed with his own. His thoughts on Jim Morrison fell firmly into that category. While Garcia and Morrison were both central figures in the American countercultural movement of the 1960s, their approaches to music, spirituality, and performance could not have been more different. Garcia, who embraced the communal, improvisational, and often light-hearted ethos of the San Francisco scene, found Morrison's dark, self-serious stage persona off-putting, and he made no secret of his disdain for what he saw as Morrison's pretentious theatricality. Garcia's criticism of Morrison centered first and foremost on his stage presence. While Morrison was known for his brooding intensity, erratic behavior, and flair for the dramatic, Garcia preferred a more relaxed and organic connection with his audience. The Grateful Dead's concerts were fluid, jam-based experiences that thrived on spontaneity and audience synergy. Morrison's performances, by contrast, were highly choreographed in their chaos, often laced with provocative monologues, intoxicated ramblings, and a self-styled image of the Dionysian rock god. To Garcia, this felt inauthentic and forced. He saw Morrison as someone more interested in playing a role than sharing a musical journey. In several conversations over the years, including interviews in the late 1970s and early 80s, Garcia made it clear that he found Morrison's self-image as a poet-shaman laughable. Garcia believed that real poetry didn't need to be announced or dressed in heavy symbolism. It should arise naturally from experience and emotional truth. Morrison's reliance on mythological allusions, surrealist imagery, and references to Nietzsche, Blake, and Rimbaud struck Garcia as more like intellectual posturing than genuine insight. The Dead's lyrics, largely penned by Robert Hunter, leaned into allegory and mystery too, but there was a warmth and openness to them that contrasted sharply with Morrison's often opaque, brooding verse. Garcia also viewed Morrison's stage antics as unnecessarily antagonistic and narcissistic. The Doors were infamous for chaotic shows, including the one in New Haven in December 1967, where Morrison was arrested on stage, and the infamous March 1, 1969, Miami concert, which led to charges of indecent exposure and profanity. Garcia found this kind of behavior not just reckless, but ultimately harmful to the spirit of what he believed rock music should be. The Grateful Dead's ethos was rooted in collective experience, consciousness expansion, and freedom, not ego-driven spectacle. Morrison's on-stage confrontations, lewd gestures, and alcohol-fueled tirades clashed directly with Garcia's belief in music as a means of transcendence, not disruption. Despite both being embraced by the counterculture, Morrison and Garcia occupied very different spaces within it. Morrison leaned into the dark, mythic, apocalyptic energy that spoke to the underbelly of the 1960s. Garcia and the Dead, meanwhile, embodied a more optimistic, exploratory vision of peace, community, and expanded perception. When asked in interviews about the Doors, Garcia often gave curt replies, calling their music too heavy and Morrison too much into himself. Moreover, Garcia distrusted the cult of personality that built up around Morrison. In the wake of Morrison's death in July 1971, the growing mythos of the Lizard King as a tortured genius only solidified Garcia's skepticism. He believed that such myth-making was dangerous, especially when it elevated destructive behavior and glorified tragedy. Garcia didn't romanticize the spiral into excess and burnout. He often stressed that musicians had a responsibility to their audiences, and Morrison's tendency to sabotage his own shows seemed to violate that unspoken pact between artist and fan. What makes Garcia's dismissal of Morrison especially notable is that it wasn't born out of rivalry. The Grateful Dead and the Doors weren't really competitors. They represented different sounds, different cities, and different audiences. Garcia wasn't criticizing a rival for the sake of ego. He was calling out what he believed was a misguided embodiment of rock stardom. He saw Morrison's persona as artifice, as something designed to provoke rather than connect. Garcia's disapproval of Jim Morrison wasn't just about clashing aesthetics, it was philosophical. Where Morrison wanted to stand above the audience as a prophet or provocateur, Garcia wanted to stand beside them, guitar in hand, inviting them on a shared trip. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.